Last week we started the 12th lesson here where Paul was going to do some bragging, having some bragging rights, and we looked at his life specifically as a defense for why he was able to boast in the Lord and what the Lord had blessed him with today. We're going to look at his case against the Judaizers. All right, and that's going to start there in chapter 11 in verse number 13. And these Judaizers that Paul is going to build this case against, the false apostles here, deceitful workers, he gives them a couple of different names. And he's going to explain why these Judaizers were the false prophets, and then their foolishness in their boasting, and then we'll finish up by looking at Paul's individual testimony as an apostle as well. So that's what we got. The tale of three testimonies here as we finish up this lesson. As we'll see, as we kind of see here, Paul continuing to have to defend himself essentially to the Corinthian Christians. Because of the things they had brought against him. All right, so let's start there, verse number 13, and let's read the first one. We'll read 13, 14, and 15, and we'll see Paul accusing or talking about the Judaizers here being these false apostles. All right, verse 13, chapter 11. Wherefore, because I love you not, God knoweth. But what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion for them which desire occasion, that wherein they glory, they may be found even as we. For such are false prophets, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as those ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their work. So verse 13 there, Paul refers to these, his critics. That's what this is. He refers to them as false apostles and deceitful workers. And although they were passing themselves off as apostles of Christ, they were in fact not apostles of Christ, but they were essentially apostles of the devil, right? I don't want to use the word Paul, but you understand what I'm saying, right? They're the emissaries of the devil, all right? And that's what they were doing. Satan was very masterfully making them appear as if they were good. Right, they were there, and it seemed, and he was taking the evilness and making it seem good, because that's what Satan's good at, right? He's the master of deceit, and he had done this with these false teachers for the Corinthians, and the majority of them had just taken hook, line, sinker, the pole, the reel, all of it, right? They'd taken every bit of it, because he had been in fact so deceitful. Example, he was portraying here excessive drinking and illicit sex as being attractive and exciting. Clergymen who deny the Bible often appear trustworthy, personable, kind, wise, right? And just like Paul says, verse 14, and no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into what? An angel of light, right? And Satan, who transforms himself into angels of light, and his servants into ministers of righteousness, because that's the deceit that is being brought forth. It seems or appears that this is good, because it sounds good, feels good, right? All of these things, but ultimately, they will be, in fact, God judge both of them, the false teachers, false apostles, and Satan will be judged, both of them in the end. So this had infiltrated the Corinthian church. Okay. What then can we as Christians do to make sure that we don't get infiltrated with this as well? So what can a Christian do to make ourselves distinct from these false teachers? How can we make sure this doesn't happen to us?
Know the Word.
All right, know the Word. Right, exactly. Know the Word. Live and like the truth. Right. But there's something else too. What else do we need to do to make sure that we are distinct from these false teachers? Know the Word, absolutely, all these things, right? Well, there's something else there that we need to make sure that we do. Stay away from it, okay? We're getting there.
Call it out when we see it as false.
Okay, that's we're on the right track. Refuse to compromise, right? Refusing to compromise on what we know is true. That what is wrong, and we continue to say that it's wrong. All right, and knowing the truth allows us to not compromise the truth. Right? That's exactly what happens. Okay, so it's important for us to live the truth, know the truth, and then be bold to make sure that we do not compromise on the truth as well. Go over to Matthew chapter 7. Verse 15. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15. Beware of false prophets, right? Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves, right? Stay there in Matthew and go over to chapter 24. Look at verse 11. And many false prophets shall rise, and they shall deceive many, right? And shall deceive many, right? Jesus here, those are red letter words. He describes false prophets as ravening wolves, right? In sheep's clothing, deceivers. Okay, we all know the story, of the wolf and the sheep, right? And the wolf puts the sheep clothes on, or the sheep, whatever the clothes, but the wool on, right? And meanders around the sheep, and the sheep get comfortable with it because it feels like that it's just one of the sheep, and then the wolf eventually gets close enough and rips off the sheep wool that he's put on as a disguise and eats the sheep, right? That's exactly the idea here in the concept and in what Christ describes them as well. So Paul starts off by building this case by essentially calling them for what they were. They're false apostles, false teachers, sheep's and wolves clothing. They are servants of the devil himself, here solely to deceive people away from the true light of the gospel. Okay, Paul goes on here, verses 16, 17, and 18, and then although Paul himself specifically thinks it's foolish to boast, these specific circumstances kind of force his hand, and he has to. Okay, verse 16. I say again, let no man think me a fool. If otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting, seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. So circumstances, Paul's like, listen, because I don't want to have to do this. Boasting about yourself, boasting about things is foolishness. But you all have forced my hand, is essentially what he's saying, right? You all have kind of forced me to compare my credentials with these false teachers. Okay, so you can see the contrast. Right? That's why he's doing this. This is a teaching point for Paul. Even if the Corinthians themselves were considering Paul a fool, he still asked them to receive him. Right, verse 16. That's what he said. Right, let no man think me a fool. If otherwise, if you think I'm a fool, at least listen to me. Listen to what I got to say for a second. the imposters, false teachers, the imposters that were there were boasting of themselves. All right, that's what they were doing. They were boasting of themselves. And the Corinthians were allowing them to come in and do that. So Paul says, let me boast about myself for a second, and you receive me just like you've received them. Okay? Is what he's trying to get across. Okay? Paul had decided here that enough was enough. The time had come for him to boast a little while as well. Now, he wrote those, verse 17, he writes and says this, that this type of boasting, verse 17, that which I speak it not after the Lord, right? So this type of boasting is not after the Lord. Christ did not send his apostles to boast. But since it became necessary here to boast, to vindicate the truth, right? Paul is boasting here to vindicate the truth. This was a defense here of what God has done. This was a defense of God's character himself. This was a defense of the gospel message, of what Jesus Christ came to do on Calvary for these people, what they had already previously accepted but had somehow seemed to have forgotten. This was a defense of all of these things. So, no, we know it's not right to brag, right? And we know that pride comes before the fall. But when God's reputation is at stake, it is perfectly okay for Christians to boast about the things God has done for them. When God's reputation is at stake, okay, it is okay. It is biblical. It is righteous for you to stand for the gospel. That's what Paul was doing. It became necessary, so that is why he was doing this. Okay, kind of. I don't want to say he was stooping to their level, but he was giving them common argument. Because the Corinthians here had become foolish themselves because they were listening to these guys. And Paul spent 10 chapters now like trying to get them to understand. And finally he was kind of like, all right, dummies, I've tried to do everything else. Let me stoop to your level, right? Stoop to this level so that maybe you can understand why you were wrong. All right? And Paul didn't find pleasure in this. This would have been difficult for Paul to do, to kind of boast in this way. But he thought this was the only way. God directed this is the only way to kind of get through, or to help get through to these guys what is going on. All right? Verses 19, 20, and 21. For ye suffer the fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves as wise. For ye suffer, if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. All right, so Paul is going to do one of my favorite things in all scriptures. I love it when Paul, Christ, or anybody uses a little bit of irony. It just kind of scratches me where I itch, right, when it comes to learning things. And it's what he does. He's going to use some irony here to point out that the Corinthians are tolerating dum-dums, fools, foolishness. Okay, that's what they're doing. And while they're tolerating this foolishness, they thought they were being really smart, right? That's what they thought they were good. They thought they were being wise and being intelligent, right? But that's not the case. It's just the opposite of that. So he points out here, verse 20, that the impostors had in fact victimized the Corinthians. Right? For ye suffer, verse 20, if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, and if a man smite you in the face. Okay? Foolish teachers were taking advantage of the Corinthians. They were allowing them to take advantage of them, allowing them to kind of victimize them, but they thought that they were being smart by allowing them to do that, right? It's kind of crazy. But that's what was happening. Go ahead, Chad. Bring up the next thing there. All right, so we have the tale here of three testimonies. All right? We had the testimonies of the false teachers, testimonies of Paul, and then believers today. So that's what we're going to be doing here the next few minutes, okay? All right, so it's already filled in for us down there at the bottom. So the testimony of the false teachers here in verse number 20, we see that they are in fact self-serving, right? So false teachers, Judaizers, synonymous here, same thing. They are at the bottom of this, their testimony here is that they are being self-serving, okay? That is what they are doing in the way in which they are teaching, and the Corinthians are allowing this to take place, all right? The Judaizers had made the Corinthians believe had made the Corinthian believers to become slaves to this Jewish legal system. All right, that's what was going on. The false teachers were devouring the Corinthians by charging just exorbitant fees, just a lot of money for their teaching. So they were coming in, they were teaching them stuff that was wrong, and they were charging them a lot of money for it. And the Corinthians were like, give me more, here's my money. All right? And they were trying to make them slaves to the Jewish legal system. Old Testament Jewish legal system, things that were going on that the Corinthians had in fact been freed from, right? That's why that was one of the things Christ did when he came. They no longer lived under the law, right? Lived under grace. They didn't have to do all these specific law things that were in the Pentateuch that the Jews didn't accept Christ, right, as the ultimate sacrifice for their sin. So they were continuing to follow all these laws because they thought that was the right thing, and they had rejected Christ. So the people that had rejected Christ are telling the Christians that they shouldn't be rejecting Christ. So you can see how this is craziness, right? But this is what was going on. And because of this false teaching and the Corinthians just taking all of it, they were getting pretty rich at the Corinthians' expense. Okay? Pretty rich off that. And on top of all that, exalting themselves as better and above the Corinthians. So you had Jews here coming in, teaching this Jewish system, saying that Christ was not the Messiah, essentially, that he did not save or die for all of their sins. They needed to continue to live underneath the law. The Corinthians were listening to it in their church, paying these guys to come tell them this stuff, and then trying to follow after this Jewish law. And apparently, when the Corinthians weren't listening to them, verse number 20, at the end of it, it says what? If a man smite you in the face. So obviously, that one of these guys thought they were pretty important. Just pop one of them, right, or hit them, or smiting them in the face, or getting physical with them. Humiliating them, right? Now, this could have been figurative or could have been literally happening, maybe. Paul may be using this as a figure of speech as well to kind of show that somebody walks up to you and you don't believe like that. Got girls at the house, right? Both of them. Sometimes, you know what? This sounds crazy, but sometimes they don't get along. And occasionally, things get a little physical at the house, right? Moxie's not doing what Pippa wants, or Pippa's trying to control, and Moxie's not listening, whatever the case may be. And occasionally somebody gets smacked, right? And then we have to come in and stop it, right? And it's a bit humiliating, right? Especially when Moxie, who's littler, who can be a little more physical than Pip, will pop her, right? And Pippa kind of feels she shouldn't be able to do that. She's littler, smaller than me, but and we've all been hit, right, or smacked, or something in humiliation. So this literally could have been happening. Also, a figure of speech here that Paul is potentially using as well. Regardless, Paul is trying to portray this is an insult, right? This is an insult. This is humiliating that this is happening. And if the Corinthians would have just taken a moment Right? Just simply taking a moment to stop and to analyze the false teachers' testimonies, right? They just taken a second, just a beat, right, and analyzed here the testimonies. They would have very quickly realized that this was not from God. Because the false teacher's testimony was a complete contrast to Paul's testimony. Paul said here, verse 21, I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Paul states here he's too weak to exercise tyrannical rule. Like he's just not, he can't do that, right? And because of that, the Judaizers now are taking over the Corinthian believers because of it. All right, so the false teacher here testimony is extremely self-serving. Go ahead, Jed, click that a couple of times. So we have, because of this is what they're doing. They were enslaving the church. They were using them. There's a couple more. They're using them for financial gain as well. By taking from the church, they're in turn taking from God, right? And they're acting like dictators or rulers or tyranny over them. And the Corinthians weren't even speaking out, right? Weren't even speaking out against this. They were kind of just accepting it and being weak in their own right. But they thought, again, they were being wise by doing this, okay? That was happening here. Okay, so verse 22, 23, starting in verse 21, which you've read here, Paul then contrasts these false teachers' testimony with his own. Okay, and he starts off by talking about his pedigree here. Okay, so go ahead, Chad. Next slide should pop up. So we got Paul's pedigree in verses 21, 22, and the trials in verses 23 and down through 33. So Paul tells the Corinthians that he was going to boast about his apostolic credentials, okay, and his authority because of that. So verse 21, Paul cites his pedigree. I speak as concerning reproach, as though I've been weak, howbeit whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Verse 22, are they Israelites? So am I. Are they seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prison more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, saved 1. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is offended, and I burn not? If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern my infirmities. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me. And through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. Paul's pedigree first, right? The false teachers are taking pride in being Hebrew. Verse 21, verse 22, Paul says what? Oh, they think they're important because they're Hebrew. Guess what, boys? So am I. They were boasting in being Israelite. Paul said, hey, you think they're important because they think they're important because they're Israelites? Paul says, guess what, boys? So am I. They're glorying in being Abraham's descendant. Guess what, boys? So am I, right? We see what's going on here. Paul, too, descendant of Abraham. And although these three terms are nearly identical, right? Hebrew, Israelite, descendant of Abraham, there are some slight differences. Hebrews were Jews who spoke Aramaic instead of Greek. Israelites stressed their national identity as God's chosen people, and the descendants of Abraham stressed their relationship to the founder of the nation. Okay? Paul says, hey, I'm all those things as well. True blood Jews, right? Not proselytes. Paul was the same. So he puts his pedigree up against those guys and says, hey, I'm just like they are. He then goes on, right? Verses 23 through 33, we see the trials. Well, now, while the false teachers here, they were of Jewish stock, they were not in the class that Paul was in. Especially when it came to trials, right? He was more of a minister of Christ because of what he had to suffer, right? Verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? He asked the question. I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, and in stripes above measure. I'm in prison a lot more than they are, right? And deaths oft. Go ahead, Chad. Bring up Paul's next thing, or give us Paul's testimony. So we see the trials here that Paul endured as an apostle for Christ. And there's a whole bunch of them that we just read. Here they are. Exhausting toil, lashings, imprisonments, life-threatening situations, stonings, and beatings. All of these things, right? He was shipwrecked, adrift at sea, frequent travel, risk of drowning, risk of being robbed, risk of being assaulted or killed by the Jews or the Gentiles, at risk in desolate places and on the high seas, at risk among false brethren. He's weary, he's in pain, he's sleepy, he's got sleeplessness, hunger, thirst, food deprivation, cold, nakedness. He's only cared for by the other churches and where he got all his livelihood from. Which trial does Paul mentions here do you think was the hardest to endure for Paul? What do you think of the hardest trial for him to endure? Of all the things here that's kind of gone on in Paul's life, what do you think is the hardest? There's not a right or wrong answer. Just what do you think it is? I'll tell you what I think it is, and this is maybe this might not be true. I think the hardest trial for Paul to endure in the midst of all this is the fact that he is having to defend himself to the people that he watched get saved. I think it's probably the most difficult thing for him. The beatings and all this other stuff, yeah, physically was very difficult on Paul. We know that. Nobody wants to go through that. None of that sounds fun. But these are the people that he loves and cares for deeply. This is his family that has fallen away from God. And he's here now having to defend himself to them and trying to get them to understand that what they are accepting what they are listening to is completely counterintuitive to what Christ has actually done for them. I think it's probably the hardest part of this whole thing for him. Self-sacrificing, right? The testimony of Paul here, self-sacrificing always, right? Daily I die dying. Paul's always giving up of himself for Christ. If Paul's job here popped up on the internet to apply for because it came open. You gonna apply for this one? You want to apply for Paul's job here? Right. It would be tough. Trials had dogged Paul's step from the very earliest days as Christ's servant. And when the foes tried to attempt to assassinate him there in Damascus, all the way through to this point now, on all subsequent occasions, the Lord was always watching over him. Right, verse 33, it's just kind of what he goes in. And then through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hand. Christ, or God, always watched over him. The false apostles wanted a rich, easy, rewarding lifestyle. But Christ calls his apostles to a life fraught with danger and persecution. Paul's life was in line of the other true apostles, right? Peter and John from Acts 4, James from Acts chapter 12, and Paul's willingness to endure all these hardships and all of these trials for the sake of the gospel proved, right? It was ultimate proof here that God had called him to be an apostle. Why does enduring hardships for Christ strengthen your testimony? Enduring hardships for Christ. Why does that strengthen your testimony?
Because God's the one that sees you through all those hardships.
Exactly, right? It gives you, it shows deep conviction and commitment, and it authenticates that Christ really, it authenticates the reality, of Christ in a believer. Okay? Go ahead, Chad. So what can believers do today to ensure a good testimony? Guard their lips. Live with conviction. Stand for the truth. Rejoice in trials. I think, and praise God for all blessings. So the self thing down there, the testimony would be, it should pop up. I think I put it in there. No, I guess it doesn't. Okay. Must have not saved it. So just like Paul, right? We should be self-sacrificing ourselves, self-sacrificing a self-sacrificing testimony is vital when it comes to effectively presenting the truth. 2 Timothy chapter 2 as we finish up here. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 2. We'll finish with this. Look at verses 4 through 7. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. And as we read these couple of verses, I want you to just kind of think about how Paul's testimony kind of matches your testimony. No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen me to be a soldier. And if a man also strives for masteries, yet is he not crowned, except he strive lawfully. The husbandman that laboreth must be the first partakers of the fruit. Consider what I say, and the Lord give thee understanding in all things. Paul's testimony, how does that match up with your testimony? As we kind of finish up here, chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, and the necessity that Paul felt to defend himself before these people and why he had to do that. As we move into chapter 12 and chapter 13 next week, Paul's going to continue to defend himself. He's going to defend his apostleships, and then he's going to deal with the Corinthians specifically in the believer's day of reckoning that is coming. Paul is going to identify additional characteristics here, and then he kind of gives the call to the Corinthians to repent. And that's what we're going to finish up the next couple of weeks, looking into chapters 12 and 13. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson. But we have, Lord, for being able to see Paul and his willingness, Lord, to do whatever it takes for the cause of Christ, Lord. And that should be a good example for us as well. It's the same desire that we have in our lives too, Lord. Pastor Rob, as he comes here next.